Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and this week's episode is the Lord of the Rings set overview. So if you haven't joined us for one of these kind of episodes before, you can kind of think of it like a condensed set review. You know, if you haven't had the time to listen to a full 5-hour long set review, you kind of just want the distilled version, cutting to the chase of what the set is about. That's what we're going to be doing here today. We're going to cover some big picture thoughts about just, my read of the set, just the general, hey, this is what's happening in the set. We're going to talk about some mechanics, some archetypes, and of course some top comments, all to prepare you for this set coming to Arena on Tuesday, I believe. Tuesday, July 18th. And by the way, I've had some questions about this, so I figure I'll answer it here. Yes, this set is replacing March of the Machine on Arena. You might still be able to draft Mom somehow. I mean, maybe they'll bring it into Quick Draft, but this is the main, they're considering it's the main set until September, which is Wilds of Eldraine. So this is what we got to work with for the next few months, so hope it's a good one. Just for some context as well, this episode is coming out about a week after me and my set review partner Mark did our full set review, so if you haven't already checked that out and you want to, go check that out. It's on the YouTube channel if you're watching this on YouTube, and of course the podcast feed if you're listening to this on the podcast. But yeah, we're a week out, and I've had some time to really let the cards gel in my brain a bit more. And also, I've gotten my hands on the cards. I've played a few drafts in the early access streamer event on Thursday, I think about 5, and also went to some pre-release events this weekend. So, even if you did listen to that set review episode already, I do think this episode still will be pretty valuable to you because I do have some updated takes since the set review. And of course, ever so quickly, before we jump in, I gotta shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. This is a place you can go if you're enjoying the show, if you really want to support. It's the number one place you can go to support me or any of my content. Feel like you learned something, you want to give a little bit back, go check it out. There's also, of course, a bunch of reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to give back to us. All those reward tiers are focused on getting you better at Limited Magic some way, so if you want to do that, go check it out. All right, let's jump in. So first things first, I kind of just wanted to give a general vibe check on the set and kind of just, how it plays out, what it kind of feels like. Specifically, I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, is this a core set? It kind of looks core set-y. Generally, kind of like they did with the Dungeons and Dragons set, they did tone down the complexity a little bit, because often with these, universes beyond IP sets, they're like, okay, we want to introduce a lot of new players to the game, so we're going to tone down the complexity a little bit. I think they did do that for this set. I think it is slightly less complex than you would see, like definitely than March of the Machine, but that was an outlier. That set was tons going on, but compared to any set we've had in the past year for standard release, I think it's slightly toned down, but not so much that you're going to be like, oh man, this is just boring. Like when I think of a core set, I think the creatures feel very vanilla on the battlefields. I think there's not a lot of words on the cards, right? I think maybe not that many decisions to be made. And I feel like a lot of those things don't ring true for this set. There's a lot of words on these cards. A lot of cards, even at common, do multiple things. The creatures definitely do not feel vanilla on the battlefield. The ring as the main set mechanic, which we're going to get to talking about in a second, that creates a lot of gameplay decisions. It really does make you think. So while it maybe is a slight notch down from March of the Machine like we saw, it's not so much that you're just like, oh, it's just, a core set with Lord of the Rings flavoring. I don't feel like that is true. I do think that one of the things that kind of feels core set-y, and here's the kind of tricky thing too, right? Like, you ask somebody, what is a core set to you? A lot of people are going to give you different answers, so I kind of listed some that I've heard people list as things that they would describe as a core set or core set feeling. I think another one that this set has that might apply to what a lot of people think of when they think of a core set is combat definitely matters a lot. You definitely, turn to turn, are thinking about like, okay, like they can attack me with this, I can make these blocks, maybe I'm setting up a combat trick, maybe I'm setting up a removal spell in response to them potentially casting a combat trick. Like a lot of the cards do lend themselves to combat situations, especially the ring. Given that first ability of the ring is your creature can't be blocked by things that are bigger than that. That sets up situations where like, okay, maybe I'm going to block a little bit differently here, or attack a little bit differently so I can block the ring bearer next turn. So there is a lot of that stuff going on. And if that's what you think of as a core set feel, definitely, but simplistic, no, I don't think so. A second item to touch on, of course, for a bit more of a vibe check on the format is just talking about the speed. And, I think I've gone on record in the past saying I think speed is sometimes a little bit over-indexed in how important it is for a format, but I do think early on, very early on, just to get that baseline, oh, it's this kind of format, it can be kind of helpful. And I have felt it's pretty average, if I would have to say, like, be more precise, slightly pushed towards the aggressive end of the spectrum rather than the controlling end of the spectrum. I think most of the decks are set up to end the game rather than prolong the game. I think there are some decent decks that, it's like black-green and blue-black that can prolong the game to a certain point. And just go a little bit bigger, but it's not like, again, it's not like 12, 13, 14 turn control games most of the time. In my games that I've played so far, there's been a good range of decks that I've seen, like some slower decks, some really good aggro decks, some just like dead center of the road kind of like mid-rangey decks that maybe could play both ways. I think that I had games, and I played red, white, and black, red mostly for the games I've played so far. A little bit of blue in there too. And I did have a lot of turns where I felt like I was off to a good aggressive start, and my opponent just had one turn where maybe they cast a cheap removal spell and cracked a food token, or maybe there was like a key turn where they lined up a really good combat situation where like I went for a trick, they cast a removal spell or had a trick of their own, and that was kind of the turning point of the game. So while the decks are proactive, I don't think it's so blistering that you're just like, oh my gosh, like every single game I'm gonna get run over. I also have seen some really good curve outs where your opponent just like plays a mass creator on turn 2 and they play something on turn 3 that grows the mass token and it just snowballs from there. I think that's possible too. So I guess what I'm getting at here is so far, and we're gonna see, I have a pretty small sample size. I haven't felt like it was too pushed towards one end of the spectrum or the other, but a little bit towards the more aggressive side than not. Another big picture point I have felt about this format is uncommon is the new rare. So I think the power in this set is really focused in the uncommons. There's a bunch of pretty good commons too, but this is notably just saying that the rares in this set are not particularly awesome. Like I just took a quick snapshot of the monocolored mythics, and there's a few, and there's like some colorless ones and some gold ones that I'm not picturing here, but it's 10 monocolored mythics, 2 for each color pair, and I'd say about like 4 of them are playable. Like maybe like 4.5. There's maybe some that are like a little more like, you could see this in like the build around C- territory or something like that. But we have a lot of stuff, for example, like Hugh the Entwood, which is a 5 mana 3 red sorcery at mythic that like sacrifices any number of lands you want, and then you reveal cards from your deck until you find like a bunch of that many artifacts and put them on the battlefield. Obviously that's not for us limited players, right? And I'm giving the mythics as a poignant example, but if you look at the rares, a lot of them are kind of similar, where it's like either it's a weird commander card or a weird constructed build around card, or a very like flavor, they're going for flavor over limited gameplay potentially. And this isn't to say that there aren't good rares, but especially coming off of March of the Machine, there's a marked difference between like, okay, I open my pack, where am I looking? You're looking in that top corner. I think now it's going to be a lot about, okay, looking at my uncommon. So I guess this is mostly just to say, don't feel too bad if the rare you open isn't that good, because you're probably going to have a lot of pretty good cards in the uncommon slots. Just some standard examples here. Reprieve, 1 and a white for an instant at uncommon. Return target spell to its owner's hand, draw a card. This is just white remand for people who've played with that card before. This card is just like a fantastic tempo play. It might not read that exciting if you haven't played with remand before, but I can promise this card's good. Grishnock, Brash Instigator, is a 3 mana 1/1 in red that when it enters the battlefield, you amass Orcs 2, so basically you have 3 power and toughness for your 3 mana, and then when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target non-legendary creature an opponent controls with power less than or equal to your amassed army's power. So it's like a 3 mana 3/3 across 2 bodies. That active treason is a small thing when this comes in, and of course, you can sacrifice it, so really powerful. Shire Sheriff, another one, 1 and a white for a 2/2 vigilance at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice a token, and when you do, exile target creature an opponent controls until Shire Sheriff leaves the battlefield. And I can go on and on. I'm gonna list some other pretty good uncommons as we go here. But yeah, I definitely think that when you're opening your packs, you're going to be looking to the uncommons, and that's good. I think it's a good thing, right? That gives you more cards in the pack that, on average, you're going to be happy to first pick. Like, there's, some sets where the rares are really standouty and the uncommons kind of suck, and you're like, well, there's a big disparity between, did I open a good rare, did I not? I think here it's like, well, which one do I have? One of my 3 uncommons, or one of those cards good? And if there are, you're going to be pretty happy with your opening picks and your early picks of the pack or early picks of the draft. So I think this is overall a good thing. I think most people would prefer the uncommons to be pushed for limited rather than the rares. And speaking of uncommons, a lot of the uncommons in this set are legends. And one thing to note for this set, there's a big Legends Matters themes. A lot of the cards care about you having a legendary creature. For example, we have a card, Errant Rider of Gondor. So this is a 3 mana 3/2 in white. when Errant Rider of Gondor enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Then if you don't control a legendary creature, you put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. It's a common, by the way. And you might read this and go, okay, well, I have to have a legendary creature. And in most sets, that's not that easy to do. They definitely have had more legendary creatures in the past little while in sets than, maybe from 5 years ago. But even still, you might imagine Errant Rider will draw you a card without having to put a card back, maybe 10-20% of the time. There are so many legendary creatures in the set. Not only just straight up creatures that are legendary, just have that type line, but also any card that the ring tempts you, the first ability of the ring makes something into a legendary creature. So you can count all of your tempting cards sort of as legendary creatures. If you want to count for how many cards you need to make Errant Rider of Gondor a good card, I would say, you want to have like 7 or 8 cards that are legendary creatures or tempt you by the ring. And that's just not that hard when so many creatures either are legendary themselves. By the way, 90% of the uncommon creatures in the set are legendary creatures. That's a lot. Or just a ton of the commons tempt you. So just when you're evaluating cards, it's definitely something to keep in mind. Next big picture point are the tricks are strong. So one of the things I feel like is a pattern for pretty much every set is going in. The combat tricks are somewhat overlooked by the masses, right? People tend to undervalue combat tricks as a card type, and that means they'll wholesale write them off or kind of be like, okay, like I'll play some tricks, maybe not, but then really not clue into the ones that are really quite strong. And in this set, there are 3 I want to call out at common, and maybe there's a few more, but these are the 3 that I've been really impressed with, and they just read like good cards to me. Shalob's Ambush is one of them. 1 black mana for an instant. Target creature gets +1/+2 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. Create a food token. That's just a pretty good deal. 1 mana, you're always going to at very least trade in the combat, and because this gives 2 toughness, you're often going to win that combat. And getting a food token, that's just a lot for 1 mana. Escape from Orthanc, single white mana, instant. Common, target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying until end of turn. Untap it. If you played the last set with Aerial Boost, you know how good this kind of effect can be. It's not super free. It's not just like no mana like Aerial Boost was, but it is a very similar card, and what it lacks in the absolutely free, you get the untap, so you can ambush something. So this is going to play very similar to Aerial Boost. And Pippin's Bravery, single green mana for an instant. You may sacrifice a food. If you do, target creature gets +4/+4 until end turn. Otherwise, that creature gets +2/+2 until end turn. So 1 mana +2/+2. Sometimes it can be a +4/+4. That's a pretty push trick. So keep your eye out for these 3 in particular. There might even be 1 or 2 others that might creep up there, but these are the 3 that really stand out to me. Do not overlook them. These are just good cards. Next up, I wanted to just quickly touch on the land cyclers. So there's a cycle of commons in this set, 1 in each color, of course, that have cycling of their land type for 1 mana. So for example, we've got Troll of Khazad Dûm. This is 6 mana, 5 and a black for a 6/5. It says it can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures, so it kind of has super menace. And it's got swamp cycling for 1. The other ones here, I guess it's worth reading them out. Generous Ent, 6 mana, 5/7, reach. When it ETBs, you create a food token for a cycling 1. I really like this one, actually. Oliphant, 6 mana in red. It's a 6/4 trample. When it attacks another target creature you control, gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Lorien Reveal, this is a sorcery. 3 blue, draw 3 cards. And Eagles of the North, this is a white one. 6 mana, 3/3 flyer. When it ETBs, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. So all of these cards on face value, just like what you're getting for their mana, 6 mana or 5 mana in the case of the blue one, are like solid. I like the green one. I think the green one's actually just good. Like 6 mana, 5/7 reach, make a food. Like that's, I think, the best of the bunch here. So these cards have kind of been the topic of debate, exactly how good they are. Do you want to be cutting multiple lands, just playing, 3 generous Ents and going to 15 lands or something like that? The idea, of course, being that cycling for 1 is a lot better than cycling for 2, like we saw in the last set, because you definitely felt it when you had to cycle your terror, right, for 2 mana and get an island. You're like, man, that's pretty painful. It takes up my whole turn 2, or at some point in the curve. 1 mana is so much less intrusive. Do you want to be playing like a bunch of these though? Probably not still, because the thing is, when you start shaving on lands, like let's just imagine you play 2 generous Ents and you play you're playing 15 lands. Well, that just means that because you have 15 lands, you're going to be much less likely to cast a 6 mana spell. And if you do, you're just interchangeably counting these as mana sources. Like if you're counting these as lands, there is still a cost to cycling multiple of them in a game, right? The first one, it's gonna be pretty painless. You can cycle at some point. The second one and the third one, you're like, all right, I'm spending 1 mana here. You do feel the tax. So I think a copy of all of these cards is going to be fine in all, all the decks. None of them are really amazing, except I do think, like I said, Generous Ent is one of the better ones here. But if you want to play these, you could play a copy. A good analog, I think, is the modal double face cards from Zendikar Rising. The lands that were, or the spells that were tap lands on the back. That's very similar to this, right? It's a tap land. You pay 1 mana to go get a land. It's kind of the same thing. You have the same amount of mana available for you for that turn. And it's a spell on the backside, quote unquote, the backside. But these are better than the MDFCs. Like, the spells on these, I think, are quite a bit better. The one interesting one that there is, like, a little bit of more texture on is Lorien Revealed, is the blue one that draws 3 cards. The fact that it is a spell, like a sorcery, that cycles, gets itself in the graveyard, that counts for, there's a few cards in the set that do count cards in your graveyard, or count spells specifically, like the blue-red spells deck has some stuff that cares about that. So, just a little note there. Also, there is a slight tinge of reanimation in this set, so getting your gigantic monster in the grave can play well with reanimate spells, so a little bit, a little bit of texture on there too, but I think I've been pretty happy, just like, play the first one, you're happy with it in your opening hand, you're like, okay, I'll cycle it on turn 1, and then, sometimes you're like, oh, cool, I just drew an Oliphant in my red deck that was running out of gas, I've got a 6-mana 6/4 trample that pushes more damage, cool. Don't go overboard, I would say, but they're all pretty playable. All right, last big picture point before we get into some mechanics. We have the return of the champion. We might have the second coming of Preening Champion here in Dunland Crabane. This is 2 and a black for a 1/1 at common. It's got flying, and it says when Dunland Crabane enters the battlefield, you amass Orcs 2. And if you haven't seen Amass Orcs before, what it is if you do not control an Orc army, you put an Orc army token onto the battlefield. It's a 0/0, and then you put that many +1/+1 counters on based on whatever number it says. So for here, it's Amass Orcs 2. You're going to put 2 counters on the army. If you've already got an army, you don't make the token. You instead just put counters on the army that already exists. So on turn 3, most of the time, Dunland Crabane is going to be a 1/1 flyer plus a 2/2, but maybe you cast a bit later, it's going to be like a 1/1 flyer plus you put 2 counters on something. So it's shifting a power away from the flying side of things compared to Preening Champion. And of course, Preening Champion had, it had the Knight synergies, had the Convoke synergies. But if you go back to the last set with Amass in it, there was Even Eternal, which was basically Preening Champion. It was a 2/2 flyer with Amass 1. That was the best common in its set. So I do think that this card is in that same tier. I think this is the best black common. I think that, like, every time I've played against this card so far, I've just been like, that's really bad for me. Like, on turn 3, it feels the worst, but even when they just have, like, a 1/1 flyer that grows their Amass army that they might have already had, that was also pretty darn good for them. So, I'm not claiming this is going to be Preening Champion level of, like, oh man, this is, like, clearly the top common, but I would not be surprised if this was the top common, and I would be surprised if this wasn't a top 5 common. So just a note, Dunland Crabane, quite good. And just one more thing I wanted to shout out before we jump into our mechanics. This is not a Lord of the Rings specific thing, but it is something that's going to pertain to the early days of the set. I do keep a 17lands.com tier list that you can find either in the description of this video or in the show notes of the podcast link you're listening to. I also keep it on my Twitter and on the Limited Level Ups Discord. If you just go to the this channel that has whatever format you're talking about. So if you want to find the Lords of the Rings one, you go to the Lord of the Rings channel. You go to the pinned comments. It'll always be there. I update these at the beginning of the format once every day or every other day. Just, as I'm playing the cards more, I'm getting used to them. Really get to fine tune exactly how good they are. It's basically, what we do for the set review, but updating it as it goes on, as I play with the cards more. So if you do want that baseline, something to check in on, always going to be there. And once again, it will be in the show notes and the description of this video. All right, let's move in now to the set's mechanics. And there actually isn't too many set mechanics. I think a lot of the complexity of real estate is taken up by the one main mechanic, Tempted by the Ring. Hopefully you have seen this in some form or fashion. If you're just listening, it's a little bit unintuitive if you haven't seen these cards or seen what the ring emblem is, but let me try to spell it out here. So there are cards, sorceries, instants, creatures with enter the battlefield effects that say the ring tempts you. For example, we have Claim the Precious. It's 1 black for a sorcery, destroy target creature, and the ring tempts you. Another example is Urukai Berserker, 2 and a black for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. The first time the ring tempts you, you're going to get an emblem called the ring. And on Arena, of course, it'll just pop up in paper. It'll be like your token slot. You can bring it in. And the ring has 4 different abilities. When you're tempted by the ring, anytime it says, when this enters the battlefield, tempted by the ring, or you cast Claim the Precious, you're going to choose a creature to be your ring bearer. So you can choose a creature, and the creature is going to have all of the abilities of the ring. And by the way, every time you get tempted, you can move around who your ring bearer is. It's not static. If your ring bearer dies, you lose the ring until you get tempted again. You can keep your ring bearer as the same ring bearer every time you get tempted. That's okay. But basically, just like you're going to be choosing a creature to get the abilities of the ring. And the ring itself has 4 abilities. Every time you get tempted by the ring, you add an ability on to whatever the ring does. You never lose any of the abilities. It's not like it cycles through. It's all cumulative. It adds all the abilities. So the abilities, there's 4 of them. The first one is your ring bearer is legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power than it. Second ability, whenever your ring bearer attacks, you draw a card and then discard a card. It's a little bit of looting. Third ability, whenever your ring bearer becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller sacrifices it at the end of combat. So sort of like mega death touch that doesn't care about first strike or anything like that. And the last ability, whenever your ring bearer deals combat damage to a player, each opponent loses 3 life. So that is a lot. It does sound pretty complex, but once you actually get these cards in play, it's much more intuitive than it sounds just by me explaining it. I do want to break down the abilities on the ring and just the strategic implications of the ring in general, because I do think it's pretty interesting. There's a lot of decisions to be had, so let's dive into that quickly. Okay, so the first ability here, your ring bearer is legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. So this does 2 things, right? Number 1, it gives you an additional legendary creature, which, like I mentioned before, is pretty valuable. But also it's got that kind of skulk ability for people who've played with skulk before. Your small creatures get to attack a little easier. And strategically, what this means is you want your ring bearer often to be a low power, high toughness creature. So something like Lothlorien Lookout, which is 1 in a green for a 1/3 elf at common that when it attacks you scry 1. This is a pretty decent ring bearer because it's not going to be able to be blocked by 2 power, 3 power creatures, of course. But also, it's not going to trade with 1/1s, right? Like a 1/1 as your ring bearer, that's okay too. But if your opponent just has a 1/1, they can block. This isn't able to be blocked like a random 1/1 token. They're going to have to chump block if they want to block this thing. They can be blocked by other 1/3s or, 1/Xs, of course. But this 1/3 body is probably the best it's ever been. Like, I don't remember a set where 1/3 was just a pretty good stat line. 1/3 for 2, of course. Once it gets like 1/3 for 3, it's a little, you're getting a little bit inefficient there. But I'm pretty happy with my cheap creatures being low power, high toughness. The opposite is also true. So something like Erebor Flamesmith, which is 1 in red for a 2/1, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. 2 mana 2/1, that's not a fantastic stat line in general in most sets, but in this set in particular, I think it's quite bad because as your ring bearer, and by the way, the ring is going to be in most of your decks. Like some decks are going to be heavier on it than others, but some of them are a little bit lighter, but just most decks will have access to giving something, at least the first ability of the ring bearer. A 2/1 is a pretty poor ring bearer because a lot of things can block it. A lot of 2 power things, of course, and just running around. 1/1s are a little bit rarer, harder to block like a 1/3. But also 1 toughness is really bad too, because that means it's just going to be able to it's going to trade off with like the 1/1s that are just running around. So it's doesn't sneak past too many things, but also trades down. So that's not a very good stat line. You really do want to focus on the high toughness, low power for your ring bearers. All right, so that's the first ability of the ring. Generally, like you can think of it as it makes your cards that care about legends better, and it lets your small things attack a little bit better. The second ability on the ring, whenever you attack, draw a card, discard a card, that does a few things. So, I mean, looting is just good, right? Just like it smooths out your draws, means you're not going to flood as often, means you can hit your land drops when you need to. But it also matters for cards like Prince Immerhiel the Fair, which is a blue-white 2/2, that whenever you draw your second card to turn, you create a 1/1 white human creature soldier token. So, you get that free effect, quote unquote, if you've been tempted by the ring twice. There aren't too many cards in the set that care about your second card drawn each turn. Like, it's kind of blue-white's thing on paper. That's what Wizards has said blue-white is, but there's like 4 cards in the entire set that I think care about it. This is the best one of them. So it's a small thing, but just in general, I definitely felt that if somebody had that second ability of the ring and the other player hadn't gotten there yet, the player with the looting ability, you really felt like you were just churning through your deck, really getting to the right cards, never running out of action. So it is a meaningful advantage if you can keep getting it. The third ability of the ring, whenever your ring bearer becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller sacrifices it at the end of combat. This is an okay ability. I think it's actually worse than the first 2 abilities. You really care about the skulk and the legend and the looting. This is basically like, all right, like you can't have my 1/3 no longer gets blocked by your 1/3. That's kind of the thing that this card does. So that's kind of a very mechanical breakdown of the ring. Let me talk a little bit about how it actually plays out and how you should be thinking about it in deck building. Basically, I think this mechanic is good, but it's not the kind of mechanic that's like, oh, I just want to draft all the things that say the ring tempts me, and then my deck's gonna be awesome. Because the upgrade you get when you do start to level up the ring, like these abilities are solid, but they're not just gonna take over the game by themselves. It's not the kind of mechanic where it's just like, yeah, pile on more and more and more and more, and the more I have, the better I'm gonna do. Like, I think it is true that the more, obviously, the more abilities you have on the ring and the more cards that you have that tempt you means that you can get a better ring, and also you can more often trade off your creature and then give yourself a new ring bearer. That is a good thing. But the thing you want to temper is the fact that not all of the cards that tempt you are created equally. So an example I would give you here is Claim the Precious, which is 1 black. Again, it's the destroy target creature sorcery. The ring tempts you. This is just a good card. You're going to play this in your black decks. You're going to pick it relatively highly. But a card like Breaking of the Fellowship, which is 1 in a red sorcery, target creature an opponent controls deals damage equal to its power to another target creature that player controls. The ring tempts you. This card is not as good. By the way, this card might look kind of good. You're kind of appealing. The problem with this card, just from the removal side of it, is that it just never kills what you need it to kill. It always just kills like the second best thing. It doesn't kill anything if they only have 1 creature, which is a small thing. But I'm just trying to point out there's a lot of corner cases where this card is awkward. It just doesn't do exactly what you want your removal spell to do. It's a sorcery. And this all means that, yes, it's so you might think, okay, well, it's not the best removal spell, but the ring tempts me, right? So that's a little bit of an upside. Yes, that is true, but it's not enough of an upside for me to be like, oh, well, my deck is tempting me, so I want to put this card in my deck. You shouldn't change your evaluations of the effect of the card just because the ring tempts you. I think that's a trap that a lot of people are going to fall into early in the format, where it's like, okay, well, this effect isn't that good, but it's got tempt on it. It must be better. It's better, but not leaps and bounds better. It's fractionally better. And so what this generally means is you're going to be playing the cards that are just good, that the ring tempts you on. So naturally, some of your decks are going to have, I don't know, let's say 5, 6 cards that tempt you and are just good. And that's about the number I would expect for your average deck. I would expect the average deck to have 5, 6, 7 ways that the ring is going to tempt you. And what that means is that most of the time, you're not actually going to get to that 4th level of the ring. You're going to get to the 2nd, maybe the 3rd level. A lot of games, it's going to be the 1st level. To have a deck that consistently got to that 4th level, I think you're going to need to have like 10 or 11 cards that tempt you. And that's just very difficult to do if you're, not willing to put bad cards, quote unquote, in your deck. So I guess the way I would describe this mechanic as a whole is it's kind of the backdrop for this set. It does a lot of heavy lifting, helps you get more legends in the deck, gives you some smoothing, right? It is the set smoothing mechanic with the looting ability. But I think it's pretty rare that you're going to have a deck that just goes all in on tempting, because it's just so hard to get the number of cards you would need, number of good cards anyways, to consistently get to that 4th level and have that be your main game plan, like the thing your deck is doing. That being said, cards that do tempt you multiple times on one card are much better than cards that only tempt you one time. So for example here, Frodo Baggins, green-white for a 1/3 halfling scouted uncommon. Whenever Frodo or another legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, the ring tempts you, and as long as Frodo is your ring bearer, it must be blocked if able. Pretty good card, and just that first ability where it's your one card that allows you to be tempted multiple times, that's a big advantage. So don't overlook that. Another one is Bilbo, Retired Burglar, 1 blue-red for a 1/3, and then whenever it leaves or enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you, so the option to do it twice, or the opportunity to do it twice. And then when Bilbo deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token. I guess mostly what I'm trying to get at here is just kind of some expectation setting for how this mechanic actually plays out. Like, most of the time, unless you just have an abundance of the good cards that incidentally tempt, or cards like Frodo or Bilbo that tempt you multiple times, you're gonna be at level 1 or level 2 the vast majority of your games. And that's actually okay, because it's actually a really good design, I believe. When I first played or read The Ring and played it a few times, I was like, it's kind of strange that the 3rd ability is worse than the 2nd ability. Like, I would think, just intuitively, from a design perspective, they would want to design it so it's like, it goes up as you go on, your abilities get better, better, and better. but I think it's actually really smart for that second ability, the looting ability, to be the second best ability. I think the last one is the best ability, the deal 3 whenever it connects, so that decks that are kind of just like normal decks that have some temp cards on it, you care about the mechanic. You care about the card text still it says the ring tempts you, because you're like, hey, I get to that second mode, that second ability, I'm pretty happy. I start to loot, great. But decks that are a bit heavier on it can strive for that fourth mode, or that fourth ability of whenever the ring bearer deals combat damage, you deal 3 to the opponent. So it's kind of like most decks can use it and not be just a throwaway mechanic, but you can't have your decks that really, really pop off. So I think that is good design. You're never going to be like, oh, well, I don't care about tempting at all. Most of your decks, almost all of them, are going to care about it a little bit. Next up, we have Amass Oryx, and I've already talked about this one a little bit, and if you've played War of the Spark, you'll know exactly how this mechanic plays out. It's the exact same thing, except instead of amassing zombies, you amass Orcs. For example, on a mass card here, you have Swarming of Moria, 2 and a red for a sorcery. You create a treasure token, and you amass Orcs too. So if you already control an army, let's say you've already cast an amass card, you're just going to put 2 counters on that army, grow it a little bit. But if it's your only army in play, maybe you haven't cast a amass card this game, or your amass army died, you're going to put a 0/0 army token into play and put 2 counters on it. The amass cards in this set are generally just good, by the way. Like, the majority of them are just like, yeah, pretty good rate. You're not sad to play them. There's going to be some synergies here and there, but most of them are just like, yeah, these kind of do what you want them to do. Some strategic implications of Amass. So you can kind of think of Amass as playing 2 ways. Either you are casting a bunch of cheap Amass creatures, like Amass 1 and Amass 2, and then sacrificing them for value somehow. Like, it's almost like you keep generating this piece of cardboard, right, this rectangle, on all of your Amass cards, and if you can't find a way to get rid of them, well, every time you cast an Amass card, you're not actually generating a piece of cardboard, a creature, you're only generating counters, so that is a little bit worse, quote unquote. So if you can find a way to keep sacking, get some value out of these tokens you're making, that's kind of cool. But you can also just build it as like, I'm just making this giant creature and attacking you, and I've actually kind of found, funny enough, that is more common in this set than it was in War of the Spark, and I think a lot of pre-set content that you'll hear, including some in the set review where you were talking about this, that the type of game plan you want is to have that make a small token, sacrifice it, make a small token, sacrifice it. But in my admittedly somewhat limited experience with the set so far, I've actually just found making a giant token has been pretty effective for a few reasons. Number one, the removal in this set it's fine. It's not like terrible by any means, but it's worse than we've had in the past few sets, I would say. So it's slightly clunky. But also the mass tokens tend to be just the biggest thing on the board, and you can really have some really good snowball turns. I was talking about Dunland Surbane earlier, the 3 mana 1/1 flyer that amasses 2. If you play a 2 mana creature that's amassed, or a 2 mana spell that is amassed, and then you play the Crabane and you attack for 3, you keep growing it from there. Like, you could have some really good snowballing turns, and a lot of the removal in this set is worded in a way that it doesn't punish your mass token. So for example, there's a common 2 mana bounce spell that can't bounce tokens. And actually, to make a direct comparison to War of the Spark, where the story there was, yeah, you generally want to sacrifice your amass tokens, not make a big one, the removal was just better in that set, I believe, than in this set. So you're a little bit more incentivized to just make a giant thing, kill your opponent with that. The other thing, too, is that sacrifice space that I was talking about. There aren't actually a ton of great sacrifice outlets in this set. Like, there is Nasty End, which is 1 and a black for an instant. You sacrifice a creature and you draw 2 cards, and if the sacrificed creature was a legend, you draw 3. There's like a red 2 mana deal 4 that you have to sacrifice an artifact or a creature to cast the spell. There's like a few things here and there, and I'm not saying the set is completely devoid of good sack outlets, but I think there are fewer good sack outlets here than there were in War of the Spark. And so that just incentivizes you to go big rather than to have this like keep sacrificing my amass tokens play pattern. Some cards that play into that I actually think we underrated in the set review, March of the Black Gate and Orcish Medicine. By the way, if you watched the set review and you disagreed with our grade on March of the Black Gate, I very much disagree with it too. We gave it an F. This card is not an F. This card is actually quite good. I would revise my grade to like a C+. I could even see it creeping up a bit more. This card is a 1 and a black enchantment at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield or you attack with an army, amass Orcs 1. So basically, you're playing a 2 mana 1/1. When it attacks as a 2/2, and any, of course, that curve I was talking about, you play this into Dunland Crabane while you're attacking as a 4/4. That's really powerful. And often what happens with this card is you cast it on 2, maybe you cast a removal spell on your opponent's 2-drop, so this gets in a clean hit the first time, then it's attacking for 3, and then you just like keep on, really snowballing is really what it is. And, if they deal with your giant thing, okay, sure. But sometimes they can't. Sometimes it just gets out of range too quickly. Sometimes their removal doesn't line up nicely. Or sometimes you have a card like Orcish Medicine, which is 1 and a black for an instant. Target creature of your choice gains lifelink or indestructible until a turn, amass Orcs 1. So you get to protect your army a little bit there. So I'm not saying necessarily one way or the other that I'm sure going big is better than sacrificing your small amass tokens. But the way it's played out for me so far has been, it would point to that direction. And I think whatever way you slice it, you want to be thinking about what your deck is trying to do if you've got amass creatures. Like, I think either strategy is fine, but you need to be playing cards that play all the same way. Like, I don't want to play Orcish Medicine in my deck that is going to be consistently sacrificing things. I mean, maybe it's not the worst, right? Because you do get to amass Orcs 1 on it. But if you have a lot of cards that contribute to that snowball, or contribute to keeping your army alive, that doesn't play that well with the cards that are sacrificing things and vice versa. If you have cards that are keeping your big army alive, well, those are going to be less effective because you're generally going to plan to sacrifice your amass army token. So long story short, on amass, it's good. I mean, I like all the amass cards. I like black and red as colors. I think that we'll see exactly how it plays out, where they're going wide or sacrificing a little bit better. But I do think it is good to decide as you're drafting which one you think your deck is doing a little bit more often. All right, then our last mechanic here is a returning one as well. It's food, and food is pretty ubiquitous at this point, but just in case you haven't played with it, whenever you create a food token, that creates an artifact token, just not a creature, it's just an artifact, that has 2 tap, sack this artifact, you gain 3 life. And in sets previously, we saw food kind of being a grinding mechanic. You'd have it in play and you'd sacrifice it to gain a bunch of, like, you sacrificing it to gain life was a pretty common thing. In this set, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more aggressively slanted. You have cards like Mushroom Watchdogs, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2. Sacrifice of food, put a +1/+1 counter on the Watchdogs, and it gains Vigilance till on a turn. Activate this only as a sorcerer. You have Pippin's Bravery, which is the combat trick I was talking about. There's some slower cards in there too, but I think this time around they wanted to give food a little bit of a different spin, make it not just like, all right, I'm sitting behind 9 food and you can never kill me as the aggressive deck, because it's like, all right, like, you stabilize and now I'm going to gain 9 life. It's a little more, using it as a resource rather than just using it to gain some life. And that's generally true, I think, for food in general in this set. Using it as a resource is generally what you're going to want to do, sacrificing it to some effects. And then the gain 3 life is sort of a buyout where it's like, okay, well, I don't really have anything else to do with it. I'll gain 3 life. A card I do want to call out, Many Partings, single green mana, sorcery, search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, then make a food token. This card is really nice because you're going to replace a basic land with this, the first copy anyways, so it's kind of free, quote unquote. And I have seen decks that would be happy playing multiple copies of this just because it's a resource generating machine. Like, 1 mana to get a land and a food. Just imagine the curve of, like, Many Partings on 1, Watchdogs on 2, you have a 2 mana 3/3 at common. Like, that's not bad at all. So a lot of the cards that care about food, care about you sacrificing food, I would not be sad to play Many Partings, like a few copies of that card. I think this is one of the better enablers. And we're going to get to some intricacies as we get into, like, the green-white food archetype, but food is pretty straightforward. I just wanted to note that is a slightly different approach than we might have seen food before. All right, and with the mechanics out of the way, let's jump into some archetypes. So generally on these set overview shows, I don't go super deep on the archetypes. Generally just give you an overview. If I've had some experience with the archetypes, playing with or against it, I'll give you some thoughts. But next week for the State of the Format episode, once I've played with the cards, done like 20 drafts, 30 drafts or whatever, that's when we'll really get into which of the archetypes are better or not so good. So starting off here, we got black, red, amass, and we have talked about black, red, or just amass in general a decent amount today, so I won't go too deep on this. I have liked this deck. This is the deck that I played at pre-release. I had a version that was basically just commons and uncommons. It had 1 rare, which is it was a black rare land that amassed, and it felt really good. My curve was good. I had a lot of good 2-drops. The amass cards just played well. I mentioned there are some amass decks that are going to be going tall. Some decks are going to be sacrificing. My deck in particular was going tall. I had cards like Mahur Urukai Captain, which is black-red for a 2/2 menace at uncommon. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on an army, goblin, or orc you control, you put that many plus an additional 1 instead. There's also the other gold uncommon here, Oglook of the White Hand, 2 black-red, 3/3 Orc Soldier at uncommon. Whenever another creature you control dies, you put a counter on it, and if the creature that died was an Orc or a Goblin, you put 2 counters instead. So I had Mahur, I had a bunch of things that amassed. I had 2 of the March to the Black Gates, the enchantment I was talking about that amassed, and yeah, I just really just ran people over. By the way, for each of these archetypes, I'm going to be covering 2 of the signpost uncommons. There are 2 for each of them. And Mahur, really good. Oglook, whatever. It's fine. It's like kind of filler, but Mahur is really strong. It's just like a 2-mana menace creature that makes all your other amassed things good. And generally this plays out like, I would just say, an aggressive leaning mid-range deck. You do have the ability to grind like a lot of your amassed stuff. For example, Mordor Muster, 1 into black for a sorcery. You draw a card, you lose a life, amass Orcs 1. Like, you know, a little bit of card advantage, get that amass train rolling. Something like Swarming of Moria, which is that 3-mana red spell, the sorcery that creates a treasure token, amass 2. You know, so you're like generating multiple game pieces. You are able to either get there with aggression or grind out a little bit, just kind of like black-red generally is. Also, the thing about black-red, it's got a lot of really good uncommons. So a lot of these uncommons are going to be good in just any black or red deck, but some of them are more effective in a black-red deck in particular. Some I want to go over here is Gothmog, Morgul Lieutenant, which is 3 and a black for a 3/3 legendary creature at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you amass Orcs 1, and creature tokens you control have Death Touch. So that's just pretty solid card all around. Foray of Orcs, 3 and a red for a sorcery. At uncommon, you amass Orcs 2, and when you do, Foray of Orcs deals X damage to target creature and opponent controls, where X is the amassed army's power. So it's either a 4-mana 2/2 that comes in and shocks something, or it's like a +2/+2 aura that deals, 3 or 4 damage. Either way, both these are pretty good. Grishnock, I mentioned this one before, is the 3-mana, 2 and a red, 1/1 that amasses 2 when it enters, and then it steals a small creature, a creature equal to lesser than the army's power you have. And then an overperformer I want to mention is Grond, the Gatebreaker. I played this one on the weekend. This is 4 mana, 3 and a black for a 5/5 vehicle. It's got Trample and Crew 3, but as long as it's your turn and you control an army, Grond is an artifact creature. You don't have to crit. So there was very, very few situations where this was not on. So it was just a 4 mana 5/5 trample. And it's pretty beefy. Also, March to the Black Gate. I mentioned that card before, but I do think that's also a pretty premium uncommon for this deck. So basically, black-red, there's nothing too fancy going on. Like, it's what it says in the can is what you get. Basically, like, you want to play the amass cards. You're mostly aggressive. Like I mentioned before, you have to decide if you are going to be the sacrificing kind of version or the go big, go tall version where you're attacking with a big thing. But so far my experience has been either version's been pretty good. Next up, we've got Red White Humans. This is another deck that I've been pretty impressed with. So the main signpost uncommon here, and there's 2 of them, like I said, for each, but the main one I think is really great in this deck is Theoden, King of Rohan. So this is 1 red white for a 2/3 legendary creature, a human noble. When Theoden or another human enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gains double strike until end of turn. So that's pretty nice on its own. The other uncommon here is Shadowfax, Lord of Horses, 5 mana, 3 red white for a 4/4 haste. Other horses you control have haste. There's only 2 horses. This one and another one we're going to get to in a second. Build a pony. And other Shadowfax attacks, you can put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield with lesser power than Shadowfax tapped and attacking. So, okay. Solid 5 drop, but Theoden is the real star of the show here. And what I like about Red White is it's got 2 really good commons. Rally at the Hornburg being one of them. 1 in a red for a sorcery. Create 2 1/1 human creature soldier tokens. And it also says humans you control gain haste until end turn. So it's 2 mana, make 2 tokens, hasty tokens. But also, you can have turns where, like, on turn 3, you play a 3-drop human, you play this, that 3-drop gets haste and the tokens. I was just talking about Theoden. Whenever a human enters the battlefield under your control, it gains double strike. So it is a really pushed version of this effect. Another really good creature, Protector of Gondor. This is 4 mana, 3 and a white for a 3/3 human soldier. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 human soldier creature token. So, we've seen this time and time again, overperform this kind of card. 4 mana, 3/3 comes with a 1/1, and it's even got the human synergy, so I really, really like these 2. But also, just like Black Red, it's got some pretty good uncommons. So all of the legends, the red and white legends, I think the red and white legends are the best legends of all the colors. Some standouts here. Aomar of the Riddle Mark. This is 5 mana, 4 and a red for a 5/4 haste. It's a human. And when it attacks, if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures in the battlefield, you make a 1/1 human soldier token. So just giant hasty beater, comes with a 1/1 friend most of the time. Erkenbrand, Lord of the Westfold, 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 3/3, and when it or another human enters the battlefield under your control, and it is a human, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn, so of course plays pretty well with the token makers we were just talking about. Samwise, the Stouthearted, this one's not a human, but it's a pretty good one. 1 and a white for a 2/1 flash, halfling peasant, legendary creature. When it enters the battlefield, choose up to 1 target permanent that was put in your graveyard this turn, return to your hand, and then the ring tempts you. So just really efficient card. And that's one of the things I noticed. I played red-white in the early access event, and I trophied with the deck. One of the things I noticed is just like the legends are so powerful for this deck. These are 3 of them, but there's like, 3 or 4 more I could point out that I really do like. So overall, just a good aggro deck, I would say. Red-white is definitely just not anything fancy, not anything special, but has good commons and has good uncommons. Next up, we've got green-white food. And again, I would say this is kind of also an aggressive-leaning mid-range deck. Has the potential to be a bit of a slower deck. One of the uncommons here, Butterbur, Breed, and Keeper. 2 green-white for a 3/3 human peasant legendary creature. At the beginning of your end step, if you don't control a food, you make a food token. This is one of the cards I was talking about when I mentioned, my aggressive deck kind of just got brick-walled. My opponent played a Butterbur. I couldn't remove it, and they were at like 9, and they just kept gaining 3 life a turn, and that was pretty annoying. The more aggressive end of the spectrum, we've got Frodo Baggins. I mentioned that before. It's the 1/3 ring bearer that, it tempts you when it enters, and whenever another legendary creature enters. But I do think the core of the deck is mostly about the aggressive stuff. Like I was talking about Pippin's Bravery, the +2/+2 combat trick, single green mana, sack a food, give the creature +4/+4 instead. Mushroom Watchdogs, the 2/2 in green that you can sack a food to put a counter on it. Many Partings. Like I think most of the cards that you want from green in this deck are going to be the aggressive cards, because all the white cards, not all of them, but most of them do lean you down on an aggressive path too. So while I think there is definitely room to have a bit of a slower green-white build, maybe you're heavier on the slower food cards, maybe you're heavier on some of the green cards rather than the white cards, I think most of the time you're incentivized because the better food payoff cards like Pippin's Bravery and Watchdogs are the aggressive cards. I think you're more incentivized to be a deck that ends the game rather than prolongs it. And an uncommon I want to shout out here, Bill the Pony. This one's a real good one. 3 and a white for a 1/4 legendary creature. It's a horse. And when it enters the battlefield, you make 2 food tokens. Okay, that's pretty good. And you can sacrifice a food till end of turn, target creature you control assigns combat damage to its equal to its toughness rather than its power. So you can make Bill the Pony a 4/4 attacker. And the cool thing is, Bill the Pony, very, very good ring bearer. Might not look like it, but it's a great ring bearer because it's a 1/4. So, high toughness, low power, just like we were talking about. But also, after it gets not blocked, because, one power is hard to block if it's a ring bearer, you can just sacrifice a food and make it a 4/4. Plus, just like, it's essentially a 4 mana 4/4. Yeah, not quite, because you have to sacrifice the food to make it that, but that is pretty strong on just like a legend, which also matters too. So do not overlook Build a Pony. It looks very, very meek if you look at the art, but a very strong card overall. Next up, we have blue-red spells, and this is a cool one. This is one I have drafted. I've seen a lot of other people draft too on early access, and it's really focused around Gandalf Sanctions, which is a sorcery, 1 blue-red. Gandalf Sanctions deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of instants of sorcery cards in your graveyard. And here's the kicker. Excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. So you have this card, maybe you have 2 copies, and you're just churning through your deck, casting removal spells, casting, just like interacting with your opponent, and you cast a big ol' Gandalf Sanction, kill your opponent's small creature, deal them 10. I'm sure you're gonna, you early in the game, you might have snuck through a few points of damage, or maybe you just plan to cast 2 of these, or cast this card twice. There are ways to get cards back from your graveyard. So I think, just like blue-red is generally built in most sets, or can generally pan out, you can either have like a controlling blue-red deck where you're more like I was just talking about, where you're more casting removal spells and casting counter spells and interacting with the opponent and then just winning some way with, maybe casting this card a time or 2. Or you could be like more of a burn aggressive red deck, right? Where you're like base red instead of base blue, using the blue cards more as like, the bounce spells and tempo cards, and using your red creatures to get in, and then Gandalf Sanctions finishes them off as kind of your finisher. There's also Bilbo, Retired Burglar. We talked about this one. 1 blue-red for a 1/3. When it ETBs or when it leaves, the ring tempts you, and when Bilbo deals damage to a player, you make a treasure token. So not necessarily doing exactly the same thing as Sanction, but just an okay card. I've already seen 2 decks. I haven't drafted the deck just yet, but LSV and Ben from Lords of Limited have both drafted 0 creature versions of blue-red, where kind of exactly what I was just talking about. You've got Smite the Deathless. Well, Ben has 4 copies, which is definitely atypical, which is the 2 mana, deal 3 in red. Got a bunch of Glorious Gales, which is the 2 mana counter spell, basically an Essence Scatter counter target creature spell, and a bunch of card draw, a bunch of interaction, 2 Gandalf Sanctions. There's a card that he's running 4 copies of, which is very interesting. Treason of Isengard. This is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. Put up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. Amass Orcs 2. So it's sort of like a mini Halo Charge Scob from March of the Machine. And this is not a particularly good card, but just like with Halo Charge Scob, if you had a good enough card to get back, maybe a card that was just like core to your game plan, you would play that card. And I think Gandalf Sanctions might be that card. Might be good enough because, you know, you cast Gandalf Sanction twice, you're probably good enough to win. And by the way, the thing that's really tying together the fact that you can have a creatureless deck is the fact that a lot of the Amass cards are sorceries and instants. So you get board presence, you get creatures, they're just not creature-type creatures. So we'll see how often you're actually going to have this purely, you know, I'm just like going all in on the Gandalf Sanctions. Maybe sometimes you're a little bit more just, you know, classic blue-red spells where you have some cheap creatures that care about you casting spells. Like there's the 2/1 that deals you a damage when or deals your opponent a damage when you cast a spell. Could be more like that, but I just wanted to point this out as a cool thing that you can do. Next on the list here, we've got blue-black control, and our signpost and common, the most important one is the Mouth of Sauron. This is 3 black-blue for a 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, target player mills 3 cards, then amass Orc X, where X is the number of instant sorceries in that player's graveyard. And it is, of course, a legendary creature. The other uncommon here is Ring Sight. It's kind of a weird demonic tutor variant. 1 blue-black for a sorcery. The ring tempts you, and then you search your library for a card that shares a color with a legendary creature you control. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle. Yeah, so as long as you have a creature, you get to tutor something. A little bit clunky, a little bit awkward. It's definitely not the better of the two here. But Mouth of Sauron, I think this card's very real. I think this card's awesome. And I think just like if you played Strixhaven with Serpentine Curve, which was very similar. It was a card that cared about, like, it was a sorcery that got bigger. Made a token that got bigger for each spell in your graveyard. And I think Mouth of Sauron is going to play very similarly to that. Like, I think this card, you're just going to bounce it and rebuy it from your graveyard. Just keep casting this and make a gigantic orc. Like, sort of like how Blue-Red is about getting spells in your graveyard and casting spells, and you're just going to cast a Gandalf Sanction. I think it's the same thing with Mouth of Sauron. And when I first read this card, I'm like, okay, pretty cool. You know, maybe it's going to be like, you cast this in turn 5, you're going to have a 3/4, maybe make a 3/3 as well. I think you're going to make like a 7/7 with this thing fairly often. Now, you have to have a highish spell count. It's, playing the blue-black control plan. But just ways to rebuy this thing. Again, ways to bounce that. I think this could just be your plan for your blue-black control deck. There's also like a slight mill theme in there. Pelargir Survivor is one I want to call out. 1 and a blue for a 1/3 at common. It's a human peasant. It says tap, add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast instants and sorceries. And it also has an ability, 5 and a blue, tap it. Target player mills 3 cards. This card is notable because it is better than the versions of it that have come previously. Like, it used to be like, we saw a version of this card not too long ago. 2 mana, 2/1, usually only tap for blue mana or maybe even of colorless mana, and would like add for spells. And then I think we saw versions that were like, add mana for Foretell or for, whatever the set mechanic was. And this is quite a bit better, I think, in the context of this set. One, because it's a 2 mana 1/3. We talked about that being a good ring bearer. 1/3 blocks pretty well too, but adding 1 mana of any color is really meaningful. And I do think that these blue-black control decks, if they're not winning with the Mouth of Sauron making a giant creature, a secondary plan can just be mill them out with this card. I mean, it's 3 cards a turn, which isn't the fastest, and 6 mana. You gotta have a stable board. But in tandem with another card, Surrounded by Orcs, and this is getting a little more speculative, but this is 3 and a blue for a sorcery, amass Orcs 3, then target player mills X cards where X the amassed army's power. So kind of the same thing. I think you can, even on a stalled up board, just play Mouth of Sauron, play a Surrounded by Orcs, and your opponent just dies. So I'm not saying this is like the plan A of the deck necessarily to mill them out, but Pelargir Survivor is a card I think is just a solid card if you've got 10 spells or something. I was happy with this card. I played it a few times. I also think with Pelargir Survivor, the nice thing about it is it adding 1 mana of any color. I think that blue-black and blue-red, because they're kind of doing similar things, right? They're pulling spells in the graveyard, it's casting a bunch of spells. You could cast Gandalf Sanctions, or you could splash Gandalf Sanctions in your blue-black deck, or maybe you splash the Mouth of Sauron, right? So I think Grixis, not full-on Grixis, of course, but blue-black or blue-red, splashing a black card or a red card or 2, I think could actually be a real thing. Now, of course, Survivor doesn't splash the Mouth of Sauron if you're blue-red, but you know, the point stands. I think that it is not going to be uncommon for you to be somewhere in the splashing space if you're in one of these two decks. Next up, we got white-black, and white-black is billed as white-black legends, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think it cares about legends that much more than any other color pair, but what it does have that I can say is it has shadow summoning, and shadow summoning gonna be one of the top uncommons for sure. This is black-white, 2-mana sorcery, creates 2 tapped 1/1 white spear creature tokens of flying. Just phenomenal. Just great rate. Good on turn 2, good later. Sure, coming in tapped is a little bit awkward, but this is just such a good rate. Like, it doesn't look over the top, it doesn't look super exciting, but what you're getting for the mana you're putting in is very strong. There's also Denethor, Ruling Steward. This is 1 black-white for a 2/4, legendary creature at uncommon, human noble. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died under your control, you make a 1/1 white human creature soldier token, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice a creature. Each opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. Also quite strong, not as quite as strong as Shadow Summoning, but just these 2 cards alone. I like black and white as colors. Just, you know, to spell it out, I think black, white, and red are my early front runners for the best colors. So nothing wrong with these colors together. I think they play pretty well together. You know, black's got some foddery stuff, white's got some foddery stuff, black has the sacrifice stuff going on. So yeah, I think this is a good color pair. We've got 2 good signposts uncommon. So yeah, looking forward to drafting some black-white. Next up, we've got blue-green Scry, which is sort of a tempo deck, although I think you can kind of play as a slower deck too. So the signposts in common here, the most notable one is Arwen, which is 2 mana, green-blue for a 2/2. It's an elf noble, legendary creature. It says whenever you scry, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it's got 4 green-blue scry 2. So you're not going to care too much about that 6 mana ability. It's going to come up, certainly. But just whenever you scry, you put a counter on something, that's great. There's a lot of scry just littered throughout this set. There's cantrips that scry. There's creatures that come in and scry. So this thing's going to trigger pretty often. The other signpost, not quite as good. And in fact, I think one of the worst uncommons, Legolas, Counter of Kills, 2 green-blue for a 2/3 reach. Elf Archer, legendary creature. Whenever you scry, you untap Legolas, and you can only do it once per turn. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you put a counter, +1/+1 counter on Legolas. I think this card's quite bad. Just like 4 mana 2/3, it starts way too small. There's no guarantee that you're going to be able to kill your opponent's creatures, especially in blue-green. I mean, sure, you can force a combat, but like, you know, you force off a trade, and then it's like, all right, I got a 4 mana 3/4 now. So, yeah, I think this card is not particularly good. Arwen is great, though. I think Arwen is going to be, like, the reason you get into this deck. There's also a few pretty good rares, by the way, that, you know, not all the archetypes have rares, like gold rares that support what they're doing at the common level, but blue-green has quite a few rares that do support it. Also, just the commons are pretty solid. So we've got Nimrodel Watcher. This is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Elf Scout. Whenever you scry, the Watcher gets +1/+01, can't be blocked this turn. This ability only triggers once, so it can only attack as a 3/1 unblockable. That's pretty good. Chance-Met Elves, 2 and a green for a 3/2. Whenever you scry, you put a +1/+1 counter on Chance-Met Elves, and once again, the ability only triggers once per turn. What cowards? One last do it multiple times a turn, eh? So, I think generally this is a tempo deck. I think Nimrodel Watcher is pretty important. Just, it's the one good 2-drop at common that you're going to want. It's kind of a column A, column B kind of deck. I did draft this one during early access too, where you really have to watch, well, do I have enough scry payoffs? Do I have enough scry cards? I think generally you're going to want like maybe 6-7 cards that scry if you've got somewhere in, like, I think close to a 1-to-1 ratio might be okay. Maybe a little bit higher on payoffs than the enablers and the scry enablers. But I felt this deck was fine. I also think that given that it is blue and green, which are traditionally slower colors, and in this set, not all the blue and green cards lend themselves to being tempo-y cards. I think you can have like a blue-green slower deck where you're maybe splashing, maybe this Chance-Met Elves grows over time rather than being like the Nimrodel Watcher, which is like more of a tempo, get you dead now card. The Chance-Met Elves comes down and starts to grow, and you're using scry as a way to filter to your good cards because you have a lot of card selection in this deck. Maybe you're even splashing. I could definitely see that. So a few ways I could see this going. When I played this deck, it felt solid. Nothing too over the top. I was happy with my cards. I had 2 good rares, and I saw them not that frequently, and the deck still played out pretty okay. So yeah, this one I'm eager to try out some more because I do love me a good tempo deck. Moving on now to, I think, some of the lesser decks, some of the lesser supported decks. Blue-white draw 2. So Prince Immerheal, this is the one I mentioned earlier. Blue-white for a 2/2. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you make a 1/1 human soldier token. That's great. That's a fantastic card. But there's not a lot of support for this deck otherwise. We have Guahira the Windlord. This is 4 white blue, so 6 mana for a 4/4 flying vigilance creature that says other birds you control have vigilance, also a legendary creature. But it has a cost reduction thing. It says this spell costs 2 less to cast as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards each turn, which, you know, if you've got that second ability on the ring, it's not going to be too difficult, but consider if you don't have the second ability, you're not really getting a discount because you're probably going to have to cast another card to get that discount. So you're getting a discount in the sense that, yes, you can cast something else plus this, but it's not very often going to be a 4 mana play. Card is, I think, worse by quite a bit than Prince Amir. Still fine, but not exciting. And this deck overall, I think, is going to be very much the sum of its parts rather than greater than the sum of its parts. I don't think the white cards and the blue cards have that much synergy between them. I think it'll be fine. It's going to do like what a normal blue-white limited deck's going to do. You know, maybe cast some flyers, maybe have some card draw, some slower white removal or something like that. But this is not one of the more synergistic pairs, I'll say that. Similarly, we've got black-green, kind of grindy, so it does have a pretty good signpost in common, just a powerful card, Old Man Willow. This is 2 black-green for a star legendary creature tree folk. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, so I mean, it's going to be a 4 mana 4/4 and keep growing from there. And whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice another creature or token. And when you do, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. So really quite a strong card. There's also another signpost uncommon here, Rise of the Witch King. 2 black-green sorcery. Each player sacrifices a creature. If you sacrifice a creature this way, you may return another permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a little bit of a reanimation spell. Again, plays about the land cyclers, but this one's a lot more finicky than Old Man Willow. I think this is probably going to be an okay deck to splash in. Like, it's just going to be just like blue-white. I was talking about as like your classic blue-white limited deck. I think the black-green is going to be like your classic black-green limited deck where you're kind of grindy. Maybe you're splashing for some powerful cards. Nothing particularly synergistic, but, you know, it's there. That's what I can say about black-green. It's there. And then last, we have red-green beatdown. There's really not a ton of mechanical definition here. The main signpost in common, Strider, Ranger of the North. 2 red-green for a 4/4. It's got a legendary creature, Human Ranger. It's got landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Then if that creature has power 4 or greater, it gains first strike until end of turn. So, you know, solid little beatdown card. We also have Friendly Rivalry, green, red for an instant. Target creature you control and up to 1 target legendary creature you control each deal their damage to target creature and opponent controls, or each deal their damage equal to their power, I should say. So it's just, you know, a good bite spell, but not particularly pointing into any mechanical definition. I think, you know, we've seen this time and time again. Red-green kind of just underperforms as a synergistic deck. There's the rare times, like, you know, in Phyrexia Albi one, it was actually doing a thing, but most of the time when they try to do this, like, red-green kind of beatdown deck, it kind of just falls apart because too many of the green cards just aren't that aggressive, and red is mostly just doing aggressive stuff, so I don't have high expectations for this deck, both because of just historical, you know, the record of what this kind of red-green deck has done in the past, which is not very much, and also just looking at the cards, there's not that much inherent synergy. So, not going to write it off right now, but I would not put money on this deck being anything special. Alright, and just to close it out here, some top commons. The way I usually do my top commons for these kind of episodes isn't necessarily like a 1 to 5, just commons I think you should note. I will note what I do think, hey, I believe this will be the top common or top 3 commons or whatever. But most of these are just like, you know, cards to keep your eye out for when you're looking through packs for your first few drafts. So starting with white here, I think the top 3 commons in some order are going to be Protector of Gondor, which is the 4 mana 3/3 that comes with the 1/1. Escape from Orthanc, which is the 1 mana trick that goes +1/+3, flying untap it. And Aaron Rider of Gondor is the 3/2 for 3 that draws a card if you have a legend or loots if you don't have a legend. I think all the 3 cards are just quite good. Escape and Protector of Gondor, the 3/3 that comes with the 1/1 token, those are just generically good. I think the Aaron, you have to be a little bit careful of how many legends you have, because, you know, you do want to enable it. It's like kind of a build around. But again, it's just really not that hard to have legends in this set. Other 2 commons I want to point out here, Esquire of the King, single white mana for a 1/1 human soldier. It's got an ability, 4 and a white, tap it. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn, but the ability costs 2 less to activate if you have a legendary creature. I played 2 copies of this in my red-white deck, and it was really quite good. I would say I had 9 legends or ways to get a legend when you count tempting cards, and just having this thing sitting on the battlefield did make combat quite hard for my opponent. And then Hobbit Sting, 1 and a white for an instant at common. Hobbit Sting deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of creatures you control plus the number of food you control. There's very few good instant speed interaction spells in this set, and this isn't just straight up you're going to play as many copies as you can get, because it does kind of have not diminishing returns necessarily, but it's a card that you don't want to draw in your opening hand because it's not going to deal a lot of damage. It's more like a card you want to draw as the game goes on. But you draw this on turn 4, it's going to deal 3 or 4 damage a lot of the time, and I think you're going to be pretty happy with a copy or two. Moving on to blue. Blue's kind of interesting. Blue's got a lot of cards that I think are a bit specific to the decks they go on, but the more generically good ones here I'm going to call out here. Glorious Gale, 1 in a blue for an instant. I haven't talked about this one yet, or at least if I have, it's just in passing. It's just a Essence Scatter, but better. It's 1 in a blue for counter target creature spell, but if it was a legend, the ring tempts you. So just Essence Scatter, it's always pretty good, especially in this set where there are a lot of instants. It's not hard to keep this up in your blue decks. Arwen's Gift, 4 mana, draw 2 cards, and then scry 2. But if you control 2 legends, this costs 1 less. Just a good way to get card advantage. It's a sorcery speed card draw spell, but I think quite a solid one. Isolation at Orthanc. This is 3 in a blue for an instant. Put target creature into its owner's library second from the top. So notably, this isn't like versions of this card we've seen recently where they get the choice between putting it on the top or bottom. They have to put the thing on second from the top. So if you're in the middle of the game and your opponent's kind of running out of gas and you use this, you target their like random 3/3, they're going to have to redraw that card in a few turns and they're not going to want to do that. And then Deceive the Messenger. This is an interesting one. Single blue mana for an instant. Target creature gets -3, -0 until end of turn. Amass Orcs 1. So I didn't mention actually when I was talking about Amass. Amass is in black and red mostly, but a little bit in blue as well. I think this is a card that if you don't have a lot of Amass in your deck, you're going to be pretty happy with it, and a little bit less happy if you do have Amass, because what this plays like, if it's your first thing that has Amass, is it's a 1 mana creature that destroys an X1, right? Your opponent attacks with a 3/1, you go, okay, no, cast Deceive the Messenger, 1 mana, I Amass 1, I block, your creature dies. And it's got some utility even if you do have an Amass army. It grows your army, maybe makes a block your opponent has worse or something. So I think this card is tricksy enough and good enough that you're happy with the first copy or two. But it does kind of have diminishing returns if you're either have a deck that, has a lot of Amass cards otherwise, or, you have multiple of these cards does not play that well together. Moving on to black. So black is pretty deep. It's got the number 1 common that I do feel it pretty strongly will be the number 1 black common, Dunland Crebain. This is the 3 mana 1/1 that amasses 2, 3 mana 1/1 flyer. Claim the Precious as a solid removal spell. This is the 3 mana, 1 black, destroy target creature, the ring tempts you. I do want to note that this is meaningfully worse than just like a murder, an instant speed version of this. Like, again, I was talking about how the ring tempting you shouldn't change your evaluation of cards all that much. And that's the same thing here. Like, murder, the last few times we've seen it, was always like good but not busted. And I think sorcery speed murder is quite a bit worse. It just means you can't blow out double blocks in combat. You can't mace up combat tricks. You can't pass the turn and wait to see what your opponent does. Still gonna be a solid card. Like I said, the rule in the set, can't be too picky about it. But I don't look at this as like, ooh man, like premium common. It's a good one, but not an amazing one. And then Mordor Muster. This is 1 in a black for a sorcery. You draw a card, you lose a life, Amass Orcs 1. And then there's like a smattering of pretty solid black cards. We've got Eastling Vanguard, 2 mana, 1 in a black for a 2/1. When it dies, Amass Orcs 1. Lash of the Balrog, single black mana for a sorcery, destroy target creature, but as an additional cost to cast a spell, you either sacrifice a creature or you pay 4 mana. So we've seen this kind of card pretty frequently in the last few sets. Mordor Trebuchet, this is an interesting. 2 in a black for a 1/4 defender, and whenever you attack with 1 or more orcs or goblins, you create a 2/1 colorless construct artifact creature with flying named Ballistic Boulder that's tapped and attacking. Sacrifice that token at the end of combat. So it's kind of like it blocks, it attacks, kind of has vigilance in a lot of ways. You do really have to be heavy on Amass, but I played with this card quite a bit this weekend, and I kind of came in a little bit low on it because it's sort of like a Windrake that doesn't attack every turn. Because, you don't always have an orc or a goblin to attack with, but in the right deck, you are often, it's very rare you're not going to have an orc or goblin. Again, your armies are orc armies. So this is more often than not like a 2/4 vigilant flyer that doesn't block flying creatures. It's a little bit weird to think about it that way, but I do think it's a solid card. Also worth noting, you can't sacrifice the token to something like Lash of the Balrog, a sorcery speed sacrifice outlet, because it exiles sacrifices the token at the end of combat. But if you have anything that sacrifices instant speed, still pretty good. Shalob's Ambush, this is the black +1/+2 death touch, make a food combat trick I was mentioning, and Torment of Golem. This is another one that I was really curious to see how this played out, because the version of this in War of the Spark was pretty good. So this is 3 and a black for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards the card. Amass Orcs 2. So I played this card a decent amount on the weekend too, and I think that the way, this is kind of the opposite of some of the other cards I was talking about, where it gets, those cards, some of the cards got better the less amass you had. I think this one's better the more amass you have, because I really felt that when I cast this on turn 4, and you want to cast this on turn 4 if it's in your opening hand, because you want to mess up your opponent's plans, I felt the tempo lost quite a bit when I just cast this as a 4-mana 2/2 that couldn't really attack or block that well at that point of the game. I always felt like I nabbed a relevant card. That's the good part of it. I never was like, ugh, their hand's not that good anyway. It was always like, I nabbed a removal spell, I nabbed a relevant creature. But I think this gets better the more amass you have, because when you're turning your 2/2 amass token into a 4/4 that has an attack, or maybe enables, it allows you to block if that's what you need to do, that's actually better, I think. Especially because this plays well into the plan of building up a big amass token and going big with it, going tall with it. Because when you see your opponent's hand, you can see what tricks they might have and be able to play around them, not put your giant token in danger, take a removal spell that might otherwise disrupt your amass army that's going. So a card that is specifically for the amass deck, I would say, but also isn't terrible if you don't have a ton of amass. It's still, I was saying, you feel a little bit behind when you cast the 4-mana 2/2, but you also get a full card. So I don't hate the card in general, but I do think you want it more in your amass decks than not. All right, moving on to red. We've got one very clear standout in Smite the Deathless. This is the 1 in a red instant, deals 3 damage to target creature. That creature loses indestructible until end of turn, and if it would die, you exile it instead. Worth noting, that exile clause, way more relevant than I would have expected. There's a lot of things that say, when this dies, you do a thing. Our next creature has that, for example. And so not only is 2 mana deal 3 just good, but that the additional clause does actually matter quite a bit. So Smite the Deathless, that's my number 1. And then, just some smattering of cards that I could see being in, any order of 2, 3, 4. Rohirrim Lancer, single red mana for a 1/1 menace, human knight. When it dies, the ring tempts you. This card is unblockable a lot of the time, because, so 1/1 menace is going to be unblocked for the first 2 turns, right? And once this becomes your ring bearer, it's really difficult to block, because not only do they need one power creature, they need 2. And so you got this 1/1 unblockable, ring bearer going, maybe looting you if you can get to that. And then at some point, your opponent kind of goes, well, they just got this looter going. I kind of have to kill it, right? And they can't block it most of the time. So that's actually point a removal spell on it. So number 1, you're doing something good, because you're making your opponent point a removal spell on your 1-mana creature. But of course, on top of that, if you're already, if this is a threat, it's already at that second stage of the ring, your opponent's like, oh, I gotta kill it, and I can't block it, so I use that removal spell, and then you get to get tempted again, so that's kind of cool. Rally at the Hornburg, another great comment here. The 2 mana make 2 hasty humans, and Swarming Amoria, another one that isn't as quite as good as the other ones, but I felt when I wanted to call it out as a good enough role player in the amass decks and the spells decks. This is again the 3 mana 2 in a red, make a treasure, and amass Orcs 2. And then green, like it kind of typically is, doesn't have like a ton of standout comments. There's nothing on this like, oh, that's the best green comment. But it's got like a smattering of solid cards. So there's that food package I mentioned earlier with Many Partings, which is the card that goes and gets a basic land, makes a food. Mushroom Watchdogs, the 2 mana 2/2 that you can sacrifice a food to put a counter on the Watchdogs. Pippin's Bravery, the green combat trick that you can sacrifice a food to give the creature +4/+4 instead of +2/+2. So there's that nice little package. And then a few other green cards I thought I'd call out here. Generous Ent, this is the Land Cycler, the 6 mana 5/7 reach that when ETBs make a food token. Mirkwood Spider, single green mana, Death Touch 1/1. Then whenever it attacks, target legendary creature you control gains Death Touch. This one's actually been an overperformer for me too. Blocks ring bearers quite well. Plays reasonably well as a ring bearer itself. Again, it kind of got that thing where it's like, okay, well, your opponent has a 1/3. They don't really want to block your 1/1 Death Touch, so I guess they'll just let the ring bearer through. Wost Pathfinder, 1 in a green for a 1/1. Tap, add 1 mana of any color. 6 and a green, 7 mana activated ability. Tap it. Another target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. So, alright, Mana Dork, definitely a solid one. And then last card here is Ent's Fury, just a fight spell. 1 in a green sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If its power is 4 or greater, then that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn and fights target creature you don't control. So the creature always gets +1/+1 and fights, But if that creature is already big, it gets a counter, so it fights super, super well. So again, like, I can see, any of these being in that list of top 5 commons, they're all, like, pretty similar power level in my mind. And that's it. All right, so thanks for hanging out for this set overview. Hope you feel a little bit more prepared for your drafts this week. As always, next week, after I've got 30, 20 drafts under my belt, I'm going to be back with the State of the Format address, much more focused on just, here's what's good in the format. I expect by that point, most people have a draft or 2 under their belt, have a better idea of the cards, so I can really point to, hey, if you want to win, these are the cards you're going to want to focus on. So tune in next time if you want to get that. If you're not already following on the YouTube, go check that out. If you're listening, there's the YouTube with the visuals. If you want to follow along with those, go follow there. And thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.